Good afternoon, Madam Chair and Commissioners. My name is Dorothy Inman Johnson, and I'm here on behalf of Common Cause Florida to affirm our support for Amendment 12 as approved by the voters on the November 6, 2018 ballot that bans public officials using their office for a disproportionate benefit. And I emphasize public officials. We were not present at your June 12th meeting when several interest groups appeared at the last minute to oppose the proposed rule because we assumed the rule would be non-controversial. We were wrong to believe that the opposition ended with Amendment 12's passage. Unlike the previous speaker, I have great confidence in this body and feel the collective knowledge and experience of the members of the commission dealing with issues of this kind and your professional staff put you in an excellent position to separate the minutia being presented from the real issues on this amendment. With an overwhelming 79% margin of victory on the November 2018 ballot, the voters clearly expressed their intent that they wanted an end to the revolving door of public officials' private interest over the public interest. The opponents made their arguments before the vote and lost. To now allow special interest groups at the last minute a backdoor process to change the clear will and intent of Florida voters would not only abuse the rule-making responsibility of the commission, but would also violate the public's trust. Therefore, on behalf of Common Cause Florida, I urge you to uphold and implement Amendment 12 as submitted by the Constitution Revision Commission for the ballot and approved overwhelmingly by Florida voters. We do not have concerns about clarifications of language. However, we do very strongly oppose any intent to subvert the will of the voters on November 2018. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Does anyone, Ms. Leslie?
Yes, I'd just like to ask if there's any language that is in either of the two new versions that you see before you that is an intent to subvert the meaning of the amendment. I'd like to know specifically if there's what of the new language is objectionable to.
I have not seen the specific language that you're looking at. We were not part of the discussion previous to this. My only concern is very generally, whatever is done in the rulemaking process does not change the basic, real, and intent of the voters when that amendment was passed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question, Ms. Johnson. Listening to Mr. Evans earlier, where their proposed language of defining public officers and public employees is so broad that it goes down to the crossing guard. Do you feel that's appropriate, or does Common Cause feel that's appropriate to go that far with a public employee?
I disagree. I think people are nitpicking certain language in the amendment in an attempt to change what was voted on. And I trust that each of you, with the experience you bring to this discussion, will be able to distinguish.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next speaker.
Madam Chair, members of the commission, again, my name is Joy Frank. I'm the general counsel for the Florida Association of District School Superintendents. And this is the first time I've appeared before you, actually in my life as an attorney, but on this issue. And I want to thank you and the staff in particular for working on this rule. It is not an easy task. I've been representing superintendents for 22, almost 23 years. I am not an expert on ethics. Whenever a superintendent calls me, frankly, I call your very able staff to provide guidance for me to give that to superintendents, because the law is very complex and very specific, and is usually on a case-by-case basis. And I don't really pretend to be an expert. That's why I support our group's effort to provide as much specificity as possible, so that not only for me to advise superintendents, but also for their staff, and particular for my comments right now. I think it's very important to have some kind of safe harbor provision that I think is recommended by the executive director in his first two alternatives. That gives guidance to superintendents and to myself as to what they can and cannot do, and I think that would be very, very beneficial. So I hope that you will include the safe harbor provision. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Ms. Frank. Commissioner Dennis.
How many superintendents are there in the state of Florida?
There are 67 superintendents. About 24 are elected, and the remainder, are appointed, and the remainder are elected.
That was my next question. And 67, did you say?
Yes, sir.
Is that the same number as there are sheriffs?
Yes, sir.
So how would we determine a disproportionate benefit between one superintendent and the rest of the world? I'm not sure exactly what the class is. Would we have to look to the other 66 superintendents to determine disproportionate benefit?
Well, it's interesting that you would ask that question, because would you also have to dissect the class and only talk about elected superintendents versus appointed superintendents, or do you look at the entire class? The entire, all of the superintendents. And I was just sitting back there thinking about that as when earlier was discussed, similarly situated. When you're talking about superintendents, as an association, we don't really distinguish between elected and appointed, but if you're talking about similarly situated, would you have to make that distinction? I don't know. And also, how broad is similarly situated? Would superintendents and sheriffs really be similarly situated in the sense that they are, for the most part, elected individuals within a county? I don't know. That, to me, that definition is kind of vague. How broad or how narrow are you going to construe similarly situated?
Don't you think that the drafters on the revision commission were certainly aware there were 67 counties and 67 constitutional officers and 67 superintendents when they drafted this disproportionate benefit language?
Absolutely.
So what did they mean? What do you think?
Disproportionate benefit for a superintendent, I can, would it be, I mean, again, a trip to Africa or a gift, but those gifts to superintendents are already regulated by your, by chapter 112 and also within the school code to a degree. So in some ways, the way I look at this whole disproportionate benefit exercise and the Constitution, of course, is higher than your statutes. Your statutes already provide, particularly as far as superintendents are concerned, a lot of oversight, governance, etc. This constitutional provision is somewhat narrow, and I know I'm kind of rambling here because I'm trying to, I don't know.
That's our problem.
It's, how do you take this, and I'm very serious about this, constitutional provision about disproportionate benefit, and how do you define that in a way that the statute's don't already define? Which gets me back to why I think you need to have a safe harbor provision within the rule so that superintendents will have some guidance as to whether or not they have had a disproportionate benefit trying to be, given to them so that they can know whether or not it is. And who you compare that with is a whole other issue. I can see why your task is difficult. And I'll stop there.
Yes, Ms. Leslie.
I'm glad you mentioned the safe harbor language. It's something that caught my attention. That safe harbor language seems to presume that the Constitution does nothing that is not already covered by Chapter 112. That's a large presumption for us to make. Do you agree that the safe harbor language says there's nothing new here that isn't already? Because it basically says if you're kosher with 112, you haven't violated the Constitution.
I think the safe harbor provision provides guidance to know what is not abuse. I'm thinking about this. In some ways, you've had the cart before the horse. Now you have the horse. The horse is the Constitution, the cart's the statutes. We've had the cart for a long time. We know how to work in the cart. And I do my best to advise superintendents not to get outside the cart. And I call your staff all the time to help me keep them in the cart. Now you have a horse. It's a narrowly defined horse. So what's the relationship between disproportionate benefit and the abuse of that and the statute? And I think that's some of the difficulty in implementing this constitutional provision when you've already have statutory and ethics opinions and case law that help to find, what the rules and regulations we've been working under for years. You don't want to, by this constitutional provision, which I think should protect all this, but you don't want to not utilize it in informing the constituency that is directed by this in trying to figure out what this constitutional provision means.
So your position is that the language of the constitutional amendment is already inherent in Chapter 112.
Just about.
Any further questions of Ms. Frank? Thank you, Ms. Frank.
Thank you.
Next speaker, please.
We're at the afternoon hour. Good afternoon. My My name is Douglas Atkins. I'm from Nassau County, and I guess the first thing I want to say is thank you for your public service. It's a sacrifice to serve in the public. Glad to see Commissioner Grant here from my mother's hometown area. So I'm here to talk about a little bit about the disproportionate benefit issue. And I think in a good way to kind of get at Judge Shields as to what the intent is the CRC's intent. There was a fairly lively debate, and we're fortunate to have Senator Gates back here, and I just admire this man so much, but I think there's a lot of wisdom that's here at the table. But the citizens of Florida are depending on you to weigh this. And the citizens of Florida are expecting and anticipating that you will execute your fair and reasonable duty. And so, when you think about the word abuse, in the world that I work in healthcare, abuse can mean acts and omissions. What you did, what you failed to do, for which you had an obligation to do. And so, as I missed the last meeting because I was away and out of town, but the reality is there was a significant discussion about CDDs, which I think is part of the controversy that you see arising before you today is what to do about CDDs, what to do about stewardship districts. And I think there is no doubt that the law has been crafted in such a way that CDDs have been empowered as sort of quasi-governments to go out and do things that facilitate the interests of the landlord. And so that's a reasonable thing to do. People go to Tallahassee, they go to the Capitol, they argue their point, they win their point, they make progress, they think that's a good thing. But at doing that, you also take on the fair and reasonable duty of being a public official. And so in my county, we have a stewardship district that is 40,000 acres. This will become the most powerful, significant form of government in my community. They will have lasting impact way past 40 years, 50 years. You cannot extinguish or diminish the role that they play. In fact, there continues to be distension and continues to be conflict emerging between the constitutionally elected government and then what you see in the stewardship districts or CDDs. And so these are important questions for you to look at. But here's a couple of the things that, and I also proposed an alternative rule. I'm not sure mine made it into Mr. Anderson's package, but the reality is that I was concerned about the economic impact, because for people to run for office or serve in the seats that you hold today, they've got to be concerned about their business. If I'm a business owner, I've owned a business for 30 years. I employ people every single day. We interact with all sorts of folks. And so I think the public official, we want to have good public officials in the state. And I think by and large we do have a lot of great public officials. But the reality is that their influence is really relegated to their jurisdiction. So when you think about disproportionate benefit, is there a disproportionate benefit gained if a public official from Nassau decides to compete for contracts or decides to do business at another county where they're not that well known? I don't think so. But inside our county or inside the jurisdiction that they represent, I do think just the simple name has great influence and bears great weight on everybody that might choose or not choose to act on an agreement or some sort of business arrangement. So I think the impropriety, and this is where I think a lot of people that I talk to have completely lost faith in this process. It's arbitrary, you can have two different cases, same set of fact patterns, different outcomes. Investigations are conducted. They don't chase the rabbit all the way down the hole, not like you would see with the state attorney, like Mr. Meg's office. And so certainly there's a fair and reasonable duty if you're going to conduct an investigation and you have subpoena power, and then somebody set up a shell corporation in Nevada and you need to know who owns the corporation, you subpoena the documents. You just wouldn't walk past it and say, oh, well, we're just going to give them a pass. Those are things that affect the integrity of this process. So to Mr. Carvalho's point, yes, there is concern. I would never file a complaint with this commission. Never, absolutely never. You're better off filing with the state attorney. Let the state attorney decide it, doesn't think there's an issue, end of story, goodbye and good night. So save everybody the process. But I think you should be looking at the disproportionate benefit rule in a couple ways. What is not a disproportionate benefit? You need to codify or think about the concept of what will not constitute a disproportionate benefit, and I think that's fair game. Because you go back to Commissioner Lesov's comment about the safe harbor, and my personal view is I think the CRC intended for this to be something new. It doesn't make a lot of sense when you sit on the CRC and you go to the voters and say, hey, codify this in the Constitution. By the way, it's exactly what we have, you know, and we're just codifying it in the Constitution for memorial's sake. That's a wasted effort. I think this is something new. I think it's something new and separate and apart from the current provisions that you have out there. And I think this commission needs to be bold. I think they need to lead on this issue. There is a crisis throughout the state on public confidence in their public officials and public institutions. And this commission is the last line of defense, if you choose to take it or not, to sort of stand up and say, look, this is where we need to be. And so, to be fair to those people who might choose to run for office, who are business owners, you need to create a, listen, it's okay if you do business in Miami. It's okay if you want to compete for a law contract over in Tampa. Just don't do it in your jurisdiction. Stay out of your jurisdiction where you are well known and well defined, because that does bear unreasonable influence on the process. So, you know, I was at the last couple of hearings and missed the last one, but, you know, certainly I think that you guys have an important task before you. I think a lot of people are watching this process. There's no doubt a lot of interest in this process. I thank you for your time. I thank you for your efforts, and I know you'll do the right thing. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Atkins, I have in my packet, there was 2 submissions by you that I have, one on February 8th and then a longer one on March 15th.
Correct. That March 15th was the latest iteration of the alternative rule. As we got into discussing it, it seemed to me to be reasonable to propose alternative rules, because Chapter 120 allows, that process certainly allows for alternative rules to be considered if they're less expensive and burdensome. And so the problem that I think that you face today is, what are the standards, criteria, and principles associated with this rule? That's going to be required. That's going to be asked. If it ends up in a 120 hearing somewhere, some DOA judge is going to ask you, well, what are the standards? What are the criteria? What are the principles by which this is being carried out? I think that's a question you collectively as a board, as a commission, need to satisfy in some reasonable way. I think there's also, you need to create and think about what is not a disproportionate benefit. So clearly, in my view, to answer Ms. Frank's comment, there was a decision issued by this commission that said to a superintendent, it is okay for you to give a contract to your stepson, because that word is not defined in Florida statute. It's a defect. So by the fact that this commission decided to issue an opinion, that provided, in my view, a disproportionate benefit to a single elected officer that allows them to grant as a singularly beneficial agreement or contract to a relative. And I think if I'd been in your shoes, I would have said, you know, we're going to refrain from that. We're just going to step back and not even answer that question. And of course, you know, I think it's important to know exactly who's asking the question, because in that instance, the questioner said, well, I don't really want to say who I am. Of course, your process is you've got to disclose, that's all public record. And of course, it was my own county's superintendent. And I think that's just wrong. So I think at the end of the day, you know, the commission process should not be used in order to create an opinion, and that opinion then is being used in order to, you know, create a safe harbor, if you will, that allows that person to act in a family member's or an associate's interest. The same is with, you know, competitive bid contracts under Chapter 287. As long as they're participating in the competitive bid process, I don't see any problem with public officials being engaged in whatever sort of line of business, because we need good, smart people to step up, run for office, take on responsibility, serving on these boards. This is a thankless job. I mean, seriously, it's a real credit to all of you to spend time and to sacrifice your time and effort to come here and serve the citizens of Florida. So thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate everything you guys are doing.
Just wait, we may have questions. Is there a question of Mr. Atkins? Thank you, Mr. Atkins.
Thank you.
Next speaker.
Madam Chair, my name is Don Gates from Seaside, Florida. I'm appearing here on my own behalf as a private citizen. And thank you for the privilege of testifying today and for your work in carrying out the mandate assigned to this commission by Amendment 12 to define disproportionate benefit and the requisite intent to obtain it. As the principal sponsor of Amendment 12, and therefore as the cause of your troubles today, I can tell you that our decision as a commission to empower you with this authority was a decision that we made on purpose. The Constitutional Revision Commission and ultimately the voters purposefully deferred to your judgment, to your role as the adjudicator of the very cases that may come before you as a consequence of this amendment. And we defer to you because of your place above politics and beyond pressure. Your general counsel properly advises you that your guiding principle must be the intent of the framers, derived first from the plain language of the Constitution, and secondarily from the expressions of the framers themselves. And in my view, your rule as it was proposed in June does that. But in order to comment on the proposed alternatives before you, allow me to respectfully offer 3 observations. First, under alternative drafts 1 and 2, the term similarly situated persons is defined as those with commonality only to the public officer. But the plain language of the Constitution is that it's an abuse of office if disproportionate benefits are obtained not only by the office holder, but by his family members or business associates. Similarly situated persons, therefore, should be defined as those with commonality not just with the office holder, but also with his or her family and business associates as expressly enumerated in the Constitution. Secondly, the underlying portion of paragraph 3 in both of the alternatives states that no public officer will be considered to have abused his position so long as he's complied with the rules existing prior to the passage of Amendment 12. This is the point Commissioner Lesnoff was getting to a few moments ago. If this language is adopted, it guts the Constitution. You would search in vain in the plain language of the amendment or the intent of the framers or the will of the voters that there be an ethics amendment that had no effect, that merely gave a safe harbor to officials whose defense of bad acts in the future was that they weren't prohibited in the past. The plain language of the Constitution establishes a much higher standard than that. For example, current law prohibits what's called special private gain or loss, which is viewed as an economic benefit. Amendment 12 is not limited to prohibiting illegal economic gains, but prohibits non-economic benefits as well. As I noted, the Constitution now prohibits disproportionate benefits obtained not just by the office holder, but by the office holder's family and business associates and interests. And so I respectfully recommend that the underlying language appearing at the end of paragraph 3 in both of the alternatives would gut the Constitution and definitely should not be adopted. Third, paragraph 4 in both alternatives defines the term requisite intent as acting or refraining from acting with what's called wrongful intent. And I take Director Christensen's comments with a grain of, certainly with an understanding that he's done his homework and understands that there has to be a mens rea. But the term wrongful intent begs the question, and was used as a synonym in this discussion today for corrupt intent. Corrupt intent is extraordinarily difficult to prove in judicial proceedings because it's infamously difficult to define in practice. That's why the statewide grand jury and all 20 state attorneys in Florida unanimously called on the legislature to substitute the term knowingly and willfully instead of the term corrupt intent in defining abuse of office. And the legislature agreed and passed House Bill 7071 in 2016. I respectfully urge the Commission not to slide backwards in defining intent. Please don't lower ethical standards. Where wrongful intent appears, I recommend that you substitute acting knowingly and willfully, which is the realistic, fact-based standard for intent supported by our state attorneys and by the statewide grand jury. Despite serious opposition, Amendment 12 was passed by 79% of the voters, earning greater support than any other constitutional amendment in many years. And we who authored and the voters who passed this amendment trust you to carry out its intent. Of course, Amendment 12 is new ground, it's complicated ground, but it's high ground. And if we're honestly perplexed about what constitutes a violation, I saw here today great work in the way that you provide advisory opinions to people who truly have perplexing questions about how to proceed. I encourage you to adopt the rule as proposed in June and to reject the alternative provisions. I understand the deadline is looming. I beg you to consider the far-reaching, long-lasting importance of your decisions which we purposefully entrusted to you. And again, I thank you for the privilege of testifying, and I thank you for your important work.
Thank you, Senator Hicks. Questions?
Would you believe that we could construct a legal entity which basically is designed to provide disproportionate benefits? I'm a zoning committee in the city of Miami. There's a fight about single-family homes versus apartment buildings. I'm the mayor of the city. I go through and appoint nothing but apartment building people to the zoning committee, and as a consequence of that, they basically vote to rezone most of Miami for multifamily homes so that they would have a disproportionate benefit, even though hypothetically none of them have a single piece of property on which to build the building, but they've changed the rules to the extent that them or their family now will be able to make tons of money, and people who live in single-family homes are SOL. I mean, is that what we talk about when we talk about the idea of disproportionate benefit?
Commissioner Brady, I'm not an attorney, but
Neither am I.
but as a layman, the answer that I can best give you is yes, because I think you've described a circumstance in which, as you say, individuals were appointed who had a particular characterization and a particular benefit, and that benefit then was carried out disproportionately in the choices and policies that they adopted. That would seem to me to be a black and white case.
And so, conceptually, what we talk about is how we have kind of organized public decision-making so that some people benefit more than others, not necessarily that they're doing it unwillfully or wrongly or corruptly. It's that we've simply gone through and constructed sets of things in a manner that the average common citizen has relatively little ability to impact those decisions when we see other people who become wealthy and powerful.
Dr. Brady, in every meeting of the Constitutional Revision Commission, citizens came forward, and even commissioners expressed their distrust and disdain for how appropriations sometimes find their way back to the interests that employ lawmakers and their families, why permits or variances or jobs somehow appear easier to get if you're related or associated, and how it seems a whole lot harder to secure a contract or a project if you're not connected. And it's that kind of disdain and cynicism that gave rise to the Constitutional Revision Commission's proposal, and in the debate that occurred as this matter was coming before the voters, it was that kind of concern, the very concern that you referenced with your example, but I think led the voters so overwhelmingly approving this amendment to the Constitution and placing the responsibility for, in effect, drawing the lines that constitute disproportionate benefit in your hands.
Other questions for Senator Gates? Commissioner Berger?
Quick question, and I know you just said that you're a layman, but, and we will ask counsel about this, but do you have any input or insight in regards to, we heard about whether or not the language needs to further define public officer or public employee? An opinion on that?
I certainly would defer to your counsel as to whether or not that falls within your jurisdiction in the assignments that you've been given by Amendment 12. It would seem to me, and I defer to Senator Grant, that as a former legislator, that as am I, that is properly a matter for the legislature to define what constitutes a public officer or constitutes a public employee. I can tell you that in the discussions and debates surrounding this amendment, there was much talk about the contrivance of using a consultant or using a contractor in lieu of a public employee or a public official as a way of sort of getting around accountability. And while I cannot speak on behalf of the commission, and only on behalf of myself and my recollections of the public record, it would seem to me that our discussions took into account that the use of such a contrivance, willfully and knowingly, would be a violation of the intent of this provision.
Well,
Thank you. And first, Senator, thank you so much for your long service and your willingness to be here to help clarify things, because some of the items that you brought up were specifically what was referenced before. I think the addition that you referenced at bullet 3 under the alternatives that go back to chapter 112, I appreciate you highlighting that. I think, as it was explained to me, and what I support rather than what might be inferred by my questions, is that we need some certainty in the process. We need to understand what is, how we would even pursue things. So the reference back to 112 was not an attempt necessarily to gut any other avenues, but to provide the ability for due process and certainty for folks that are in the place. I heard what you said, and I wish you would offer exactly what you would say that would allow us the ability to use the 40-some years of experience that we have as a commission to continue to provide the ethics process without gutting, because I don't think the intent was to cut, but just to provide certainty.
Well, let me say, Commissioner, first that what I think does gut the Constitution is the notion of saying, well, as long as you comply with the law as we do it in the past, you're good for the future, and that this amendment really has no effect whatsoever. It's simply an affirmation of the way we were used to do things. I think that would be gutting, and it would poke the voters in the eye. I wish I could tell you that I had a recipe for how you can tweezer through all of the what ifs and for instances, and how many sheriffs can dance on the head of a pin in the basement with swimmers. But I can tell you that Frank Krugenbacher, a former chairman of this commission and a co-sponsor of this provision, working with me, and Frank gets no blame, but he gets credit for suggesting that you have this responsibility of articulating these definitions, because candidly, we didn't believe that it should be, that we ought to turn the Constitution into the book of Leviticus and try to think of everything that might go wrong and then prescribe and proscribe what to do about it. Nor, candidly, did we think that it was something that properly could be handled in the legislative process, because the legislative process is, well, the legislative process. And so my best answer is to simply say, someone has to be trusted to be above politics, beyond pressure, and use the 40 years of experience to tweezer through this, recognizing that you're going to be creating precedents, and those precedents will then give rise to guidance that you can provide through advisory opinions. I guess the short answer is, we trust you.
Cheers, thank you so much. Two other items. On section 4 that you mentioned, and I'm glad you actually clarified something that came up last time. The prior language had the implication that you could somehow be held accountable for things that you didn't do, but you didn't even know that you weren't doing. And the whole idea of you using the words knowingly and willfully really go back to this whole point. Abuse is something that you know that you're engaging in some way. Is that what you're trying to suggest to us by this?
Yes, and I take Executive Director Anderson's comments very seriously, that you can't just that you have to ascribe some sort of intent. An intent, requisite intent, is part of your assignment. But there's a big difference, and I defer to competent counsel, and I especially defer to Commissioner Meggs, having been a state attorney and being part of the group of state attorneys who recommended that the legislature not use the term corrupt intent, but rather use knowingly and willfully as a better way to determine abuse of the public trust. You not only need to know it, but you need to have willfully done it. You knew it was wrong and you willfully did it. And I again defer to counsel, but I believe that that is much more of a fact-based approach to proving abuse than relying upon the ability to divine corrupt intent somehow, which has proved to be extraordinarily difficult, as pointed out by the statewide grand jury and by all 20 state attorneys.
Through the chair, if I may, for the last item, the council that represented this rule for us on the commission staff read a letter to the editor that you wrote, or an opinion piece that talked about the opportunities that we're facing. If I'm properly interpreting what you're saying and what you intended, and you are a very wise man, so I may not be, so I just want to be very clear. You're suggesting that we have an opportunity to expand things, but the only thing that I heard that might be limiting is your concerns about item 3. Is that the only thing that would go against potentially the opinion piece that you wrote?
And I apologize, I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that. I recall the opinion piece.
That we were at a landmark opportunity to expand the scope of ethics and provide things. And by the way, I would interpret class in a gift to travel to Africa as any public official as opposed to anything. I wouldn't compare. There's no sheriff and there's no position that would allow.
Yeah, the African safaris was pretty easy. Even those of us in sheep seats knew that was wrong.
Yeah. So I think the only thing that I've heard that gives me concern about the rules that you have is I've actually listed under item 3, which would limit it to what we had before. You know, grandfathering in basically, or safe harboring folks.
Yeah. What I meant in saying that the commission has an opportunity to expand the importance of ethics in public office wasn't that you would embroider on the Constitution or that you would go beyond the Constitution, but rather that you would fulfill the Constitution, whose plain intent is to do more than we've done. And my entreaty was that you not retreat into a safe harbor, or that you not water down intent by looking for ways to carve out certain groups because there are difficulties in deciding how to treat them. I'm a former superintendent of schools. I was never a sheriff. I can tell you, for example, first of all, superintendents of schools are part of a group called constitutional officers. Secondly, there are appointed and elected superintendents. The law says elected superintendents, compensation and benefits are set by law. Pretty simple. Appointed superintendents, compensation and benefits are set in negotiation and by contract. And so there are distinctions that I believe can be drawn, even by a layman looking at this as I do. And I'm sure with your wisdom and your counsel, you'll be able to do it certainly far better than me.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Further questions?
Thanks, ma'am.
Thank you.